Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Hainline, the NCAA Chief Medical Officer, and welcome to another SSI Spotlight session. Recall that we had 5 previous Spotlight series sessions on mental health and 2 on concussion. Today's Spotlight is on student-athlete health and wellness study findings. So the information in today's session is regarding findings from the first student-athlete health and wellness study. And this is actually going to provide a foundation for subsequent spotlight sessions that are going to continue to focus on mental health, but also address other issues such as cannabinoids, pain management, sleep, and related areas. We have 2 special guests today, Lydia Bell, the Director of Research and Policy at the NCAA, and Kelsey Gurganus-Wright, who's the Associate Director of Research on student-athlete well-being and experiences. They're going to take you through this study with a slide deck and provide an overview of how it was conducted. So really looking forward to hearing from Lydia and Kelsey, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hainline, and thank you all for tuning in today to hear some findings on this really important study that we're excited to share. So historically, our research team has partnered with faculty athletics representatives to gain insight into student-athlete health and well-being through a range of national surveys. The 10th iteration of the NCAA substance use study was planned for 2021, but due to the pandemic, we decided to postpone the study. During this time, in collaboration with our NCAA Sports Science Institute teammates, we identified the need to conduct a more comprehensive student-athlete health and wellness study. And to accommodate this survey in the rotation of our studies, we pulled key items from the substance use study, and those were subsumed within the survey instrument that we used. The paper survey was administered on campuses by faculty athletics reps during the last academic year, and we had more than 23,000 student athletes participate in the study. Today, Dr. Bell and I are going to show you findings related to student athlete substance use, mental health, sleep, youth sport, specialization, injury, and overall wellness support. We'll also share with you at the end where you can access these data. So starting with student-athlete substance use, and some positive news, student-athletes have shown a significant decrease over the years in alcohol use, which is right in line with the larger trend that we are seeing in this age group of college students generally. Most recently, 72% of student-athletes reported using alcohol within the last year. The rate does remain higher among women's sports at 76% compared to men's sports at 68%. Even more positive news with binge drinking. Binge drinking is defined as women having 4 or more drinks and men having 5 or more drinks in a single sitting. The percent of student-athlete binge drinkers has dropped to lows from 55% in 2009 to 35% in this study. And when we compare student-athletes to the college student population broadly, we typically see that alcohol use, as well as other substance use, is lower for NCAA athletes. Still important to recognize here that alcohol is the most used substance among this age group. The student body data in the middle is from the 2023 American College Health Association's National College Health Assessment. And the data on the far right is from the Monitoring the Future study out of the University of Michigan. You'll see this table a few more times throughout the presentation as we cover various drug categories. So the use of most tobacco and nicotine products in the past year is down compared to prior studies. Notable decreases seen here in the use of cigars, which is that green line down to 12%, spit tobacco in that light blue line down to 10%, hookah in the orange line down to 4%. And student-athlete cigarette use has remained steady since 2013, but you can see here that vaping nicotine did see a substantial increase, which is right in line with what we are seeing in this generation of students broadly. The student-athlete rate of vaping is below the overall college student rate reported in the Monitoring the Future study. Cigarette use is also lower among student athletes. More positive news here with spit tobacco, where we have historically seen significant concerns in several men's sports. Baseball, wrestling, men's lacrosse, and men's ice hockey have consistently had high rates, as high as 40 to 50%, depending on the study year. However, with the exception of ice hockey, which remains at the top currently, we are seeing big drops in those sports in this study. Reported rates of marijuana use by methods of inhalation or ingestion are comparable to 2017, with a slight increase among women's sports student athletes. When we compare past year marijuana use to student body data, student athletes are much lower at 26% compared to 38% from the ACHA study and 41% from the Monitoring the Future study. And then in terms of divisional differences, Division III student athletes have consistently been the highest users of marijuana or cannabis, most recently at 30%. But Division I student athletes have narrowed that gap, increasing from just under 18% in 2017 up to 23% currently. And then when we look by sport on the men's side, lacrosse, swimming, and ice hockey were the highest users, all with 1/3 or more reporting use in the past year. And on the women's side, 1/3 more reported use in rowing and ice hockey in the past year. And then in this study, in the 2017 study, we asked how student athletes were consuming marijuana or other cannabis products. We found that use by smoking, vaping, or any other method of inhalation has been steady at the 23 to 24% range. But there was an increase in the use of ingestible products in the past year, up from 11% in 2017 to 17% currently. We also saw a large increase among those using synthetic marijuana products. I think the most important takeaway here is that while overall use rates haven't changed much for student athletes since 2017, it may be that users are enjoying more forms of the drug rather than those alternative forms, leading to more student athlete users. Much of these shifts could also be tied to increased access to new types of products. So when we look at use as a function of state law, we see higher rates among student athletes attending college in states where it's fully legal for recreation or medical use. As high as 43% of student athletes reported using marijuana in states where it's fully legal, 35% in states where it's legal for medical use only, and 28% among those in states where it's not legal. Shifting gears here to some more positive news from the study, we are seeing a downward trend in the reported use of narcotic pain meds like Vicodin, OxyContin, and other opioids, both with and without a prescription. In the last decade, those using pain meds with a prescription are down from a high of 18% to just under 6%, and use without a prescription is down from a high of nearly 6% to under 2%. Rates for all men's sports are 6% or below now. Most notable decreases from 2017 are in lacrosse, down from 17% to 5%, and ice hockey down from 13% to 3%. Rates for all women's sports are 8% or below, largest drops among gymnastics student athletes, down from 18% to 8%, and ice hockey down from 13% to 4%. More good news here in terms of medication misuse. We are also seeing a downward trend in the use of ADHD stimulants like Adderall, Concerta, and others without a prescription, down from about 8% in 2017 to 2% in this study. Prescription use of stimulants has remained fairly steady. So shifting gears here to mental health findings. We're seeing that mental health concerns for student athletes generally have improved since 2020, especially in terms of sleep difficulties, loneliness, sadness, and loss, but we are still seeing relatively high levels. This slide shows rates of mental health concerns among men's sports student athletes. The data on the far right were collected during the last academic year from this study. The three columns in the middle are from the COVID-19 well-being studies we administered online shortly following the onset of COVID-19 in April 2020, 6 months later in October of 2020, and then finally again in October of 2021. Since 2021, the most notable decrease was in the number of men who felt overwhelmed by everything constantly or almost every day, down from 25% to 17%. Notable decrease also in the percent of men who felt mentally exhausted, down from 22% to 16%. And then on the women's side, mental health concerns across the board look very similar to the rates we saw in 2021. Most recently, we found that a little less than half of women felt overwhelmed constantly or almost every day. 1/3 felt mentally exhausted, and just under 30% felt overwhelming anxiety and experienced sleep difficulties. Over the course of the 4 surveys, women's rates of mental exhaustion, overwhelming anxiety, and those who felt so depressed it was difficult to function have remained relatively unchanged. And then compared side by side, we see that women consistently report higher rates of concern than men, and in many cases, 2 to 3 times higher. In terms of other disparities, mental health struggles continue to be highest among demographic subgroups commonly displaying higher rates of mental distress, including student athletes of color and those identifying as LGBTQ+. So here I wanted to draw your attention to some of the most striking differences of queer spectrum student athletes. This group includes any participant who self-identified as gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, queer, questioning, or another identity. Rates of feeling overwhelmed, mentally exhausted, anxious, and so on are roughly 2 times higher across the board for student athletes identifying on the queer spectrum compared to rates of student athletes identifying as straight. And then when we look by gender identity, we had 148 participants who identified as either transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, or multiple gender identities. We see the highest rates of mental health concerns in this group. 1/2 or more felt overwhelmed and mentally exhausted constantly or almost every day. Over 40% experienced sleep difficulties, and 30% or more felt overwhelming anxiety or sadness. We asked student athletes what factors were most negatively impacting their mental health in the month before the survey. Student athletes noted academics, planning for the future, and financial worries as the top factors negatively impacting their mental health. Comparing by sport gender, we see high endorsement for women's sports student athletes across the board, but it's worth noting here that those first 2 factors, academics and planning for the future, were 15 points higher for women as compared to the men's side. Also noteworthy are the differences in factors related to sport or team, like coach relationships were 7 points higher on the women's side, and the overall team environment 10 points higher. And then just shifting gears one more time to sleep for me, we can't overstate in terms of overall well-being how important sleep is to physical and mental health. Data from this study suggests that we have a lot of work to do in this area. Nearly 1/2 of student athletes reported 0 to 3 days in the past week where they got enough sleep that they felt rested when they woke up. 1/3 reported getting restful sleep on 4 to 5 days, and another 20% reported getting restful sleep almost every day. Men's sports reported more days of restful sleep than women and showed a notable increase in the percent who reported getting restful sleep on 6 to 7 days in the past week, up from 19% in 2019 to 25% currently. Here you see physical and mental functioning as it relates to restful sleep. We see that those student athletes who reported 0 to 3 days of restful sleep in the past week are much more likely to report feeling tired from physical and mental demands of their sport, and less likely to feel that they are performing up to their ability. Of those student athletes who reported getting 6 to 7 days of restful sleep in the past week, 57% believe that they were performing up to their ability, compared to just 40% in the 0 to 3 group. And then in terms of poor sleep behaviors, women's sports are higher than men's sports across the board. In 4 or more days in the past week, so over half the week, more than 60% of women reported feeling tired or dragged out during the day compared to just over 40% for men. 1/3 of women had to go to bed due to exhaustion compared to about 1/4 of men, and 1/4 of women reported having had a hard time falling asleep compared to 19% for men. So I will stop here now and turn it over to Dr. Bell to discuss some of our next areas of findings.
Thanks so much, Kelsey. Really appreciate it. We really wanted to look at, for our student athletes, when did they all begin playing their sport and when did they specialize in their sport? So what you see here in this data, really in the dark blue, is our student athletes who began playing their sport at the age of 6 or younger. This is for our men's sports athletes across all 3 divisions. And you can see, for some of our athletes in baseball, ice hockey, soccer, over 3/4 of those student athletes began playing by the time they were 6. We also have quite a few student athletes, if you combine both that dark blue and the orange, who've been competing in their sport since they were below the age of 10. So really high rates of participation across the board. If we go to the next slide, we can see the same data for women. So again, calling your attention to that dark blue and the orange. In many of our women's sports, over 90% began competing in their sport by the time that they were 10. Looking at soccer, gymnastics, near 90% again in softball, almost 90% in ice hockey and basketball. So really, for many of our athletes, they have been engaging in their sport since a very young age. But I think the next slide is really, and I think Dr. Hainline could also, talk a little bit about this too, but, we're really interested in when our student athletes specialize in their sport. And when we talk about specializing, what we're talking about is really dropping all other sports to focus on one specific sport, the sport that they're playing in college. And why age 12 is because, we know that for those athletes that specialize by the age of 12, they are more likely to report not only mental burnout in their sport, but they may be more likely to also experience some overuse injuries, which is really why, that age of 12 is what we're prompted to kind of examine. And what you can see here, again, these are our men's sports athletes across all 3 divisions. But we have about 2/3 of our student athletes in men's soccer who are specialized by the age of 12, the highest of all of our sports. But about half in ice hockey and tennis are also specializing by that age. We do see some variation by division in terms of these data, with some of our Division I student athletes slightly more likely to specialize by the age of 12. But in general, these numbers are fairly consistent across the 3 divisions. In terms of our women, gymnastics certainly stands out here, but if we think about, all the times we spent watching the Olympics, and we know it's one of our younger sports, but almost 90% of our student athletes who are gymnasts have specialized by the age of 12. But over half in soccer, swimming and diving, and tennis for our women's sports student athletes. So we have many of our athletes, who are making the decision to specialize by the time they are 12. When we asked about specialization, part of what we were interested in is, might this relate to injury for our student athletes? We were interested in not only injury during college, but also whether or not they had faced major injuries prior to coming to college. And when we talk about major injury, the way that we define it for our student athletes who are taking the survey is it's a sport-related injury that requires surgery, hospitalization, or more than a month away from training and competition. So that's how we're defining major sport-related injuries. As you can see, in many of our sports, actually in over more than half of our men's sports, ice hockey, wrestling, soccer, lacrosse, football, baseball, and basketball, over half of our student athletes have faced at least one major injury prior to coming to college. You can see, in some of our sports, ice hockey and wrestling, we have, almost 20% of those student athletes who have faced 3 or more injuries. But really across the board, many of our student athletes have faced at least one injury prior to coming to college. At the same time, thinking about for our student athletes, how might this also relate to their injuries during college? We're going to look specifically at those who are in their junior year and above, but we also see some of those sports that also stood out for us in terms of high school injury reports, specific wrestling, certainly. We can see a lot of our student athletes also facing major sport-related injuries during college. And again, we defined it in the exact same way. So a injury that is defined by surgery, hospitalization, or at least a month away from training or competition. So you can see for many of our student athletes, over half in wrestling, basketball, and football, and also track and field. We have many of our student athletes facing at least one major injury while they're in college by the time they're a junior. For our women's sports athletes, gymnastics always stands out to me here, with 41% of our women's gymnasts reporting that they have faced at least 3 or more major sport-related injuries even before coming to college. But over half of our student athletes reporting at least one injury in gymnastics, soccer, basketball, and softball, and just under half in track and field as well. When we look at college for those student athletes, again, really looking at those juniors and above, gymnastics is still here in terms of the highest rates of injury. We also see over half of our women's basketball student athletes facing at least one major injury during college, and just over half in track and field as well. So really, for us, we were really interested in, what was the intersection, if any, in those who had faced injuries prior to coming to college, and how might that relate to the injury that they faced during college. And what you see here for our student athletes who had at least one pre-college major injury, they were more likely to also report facing a major injury during college, almost twice the rate in men's soccer, and about 1.5 times the rate of our women's soccer student athletes. This really showing a relationship between those who had faced a pre-college injury and then again facing an injury in college. We have no indication of whether or not it was the same sort of injury, so it may not be a re-injuring, but our student athletes who were injured pre-college were more likely to report injury during college as well. We also took a look at men's and women's basketball just to see if this relationship continued to hold, and it did. Again, our student athletes who had faced an injury prior to college were more likely to report facing a major injury while in college as well, in both men's and women's basketball. This study, in addition to examining our student athletes' mental health and substance use, we were also really interested in weight and body image for our student athletes. I think one of the most, for me, one of the most telling questions that I always want to point people's attention to is right here in the middle of your screen. The question is, for our student athletes, how are you describing your weight? And about 2/3 of our student athletes in both men's and women's sports indicate that they are about the right weight for their sport. However, when we ask them about their weight and what they're trying to do in terms of maintaining their weight, I think it may pique your interest to find that even though about 2/3 of our student athletes think that they are the right weight for their sport, we still see 43% of our men's sports athletes saying that they are trying to gain weight. So regardless of how they're currently feeling in terms of the size for their sport, there are a disproportionate number of our men's sports athletes trying to gain weight. And you see almost the opposite story for our women's sports athletes. So even though about 2/3 say that they are about the right weight for their sport, we still have almost half of our women's sports student athletes trying to lose weight during the time of this survey. We also asked, taking that same question and looking at how does it, do we see anything different in terms of sport? You can see for our sports that are most likely to indicate that they're trying to gain weight, men's basketball stands out, and football, with about half of those student athletes trying to gain weight. I think your eye may also be drawn to our men's wrestling student athletes, which is the only sport where the men are more likely to indicate that they're trying to lose weight as compared to trying to gain weight. For our women's sports student athletes, almost across the board, we see those very high dark blue bars of our women's sports athletes trying to lose weight, particularly in soccer, tennis, lacrosse, and golf. The one sport where women are more likely to report wanting to gain weight is our women's basketball student athletes, but still that's less than 20% of the student athletes in the sample. We also asked our student athletes about their body image. Questions like, I think I have a good body, I'm happy with my current weight, and I like what I look like in pictures. And as you can see, across the board, men are more likely to endorse agreeing or strongly agreeing to the statements that I just read to you. Over 2/3 of men think that they have a good body compared to less than half of our women's sports student athletes. Over half of men's sports athletes are happy with their current weight compared to just about 1/3 of our women's sports athletes. And also, only less than 1/3 of our women's sports athletes like what they look like in pictures as compared to nearly 60% of our men's sports athletes. Nutritional habits for our student athletes. I think we expect that many of our student athletes in general are trying very hard they're very conscientious about their diet and nutrition as it relates to their sport. And you can see that kind of play out here with over half of our student athletes saying that they generally try to have a healthy diet. We do find that men are more likely to make an effort to eat at least 3 meals a day. However, in a little bit more of a further, analysis in this item, it does seem that, especially for our student athletes who are actively trying to lose weight, there certainly is less of an effort to eat 3 meals a day in terms of, maybe suppressing that caloric intake. Over half of our student athletes are making an effort to eat fruits and vegetables as well. But many of our student athletes, almost 1/4, say that they avoid eating fried foods when possible. All right. Part of, in addition to not only student athletes' conscious decisions about what food to eat and thinking about, maintaining their weight, we also are really interested in student athletes' access to healthy food on their campuses. So really more about, what they can access in terms of food available to them, and not so much about choices. Student athletes, about 43% of our men's sport athletes, under 1/3 of women, said that healthy food options are readily available to me after practice and competition. We definitely saw some differences in that in terms of division, with Division II student athletes being the least likely to say that those healthy food options are readily available. For our student athletes also, indicating that they can afford to eat healthy meals each day, we do see it's about under half of our student athletes agreeing to this item, that they can afford to eat healthy meals each day. And again, we did see some divisional differences, and we'll be having a release coming out soon with additional slides specific to to nutrition and food access, and you'll be able to kind of see some differences in terms of division. Part of it too is also that I have time to eat healthy meals each day. Half of our men's sports athletes indicate that they do have that time, but it's about 1/3 of our women's sports athletes. And we do know from some of our previous research and our goals study for student athletes, that our women's sports athletes are more likely to report spending more hours in a given day, really dedicated towards their academics. So there could be other, pressures for our student athletes beyond competition, but also, in pulling away their time and how they're able to spend their days on campus. All right. In terms of support for our student athletes, we did want to ask them a bit about access to resources. Certainly, we see a majority of our student athletes feeling that their coaches care about their mental well-being, but they are less likely to feel comfortable talking to their coaches about mental health issues. Just over half of our men's sports athletes, only 40% of women's sports athletes would feel comfortable talking with their coaches. You see some higher numbers on the right-hand side in terms of the coaches caring about our student athletes' physical well-being. Almost 3/4 indicate that they perceive that level of care, and they are much more comfortable talking with their coaches about physical health issues when you compare that to how comfortable they are in talking to their coaches about mental health issues. We did ask this item, with their coaches caring about their mental well-being. We've asked it in our goals survey as well. And you can see that there is a bit of a decline for our student athletes, particularly among our women's sports athletes, and how they're responding to this item. We're not really sure, maybe what has changed. We know from our survey that we did recently with coaches and their mental well-being. We know that coaches care deeply about student athletes' mental well-being and are definitely spending way more time than they have in the past talking to student athletes about mental wellness. But clearly here there is a bit of a disconnect potentially for some of our women's sports athletes in perceiving the coach care in that space. And in terms of feeling comfortable talking to their coaches about mental health issues, you can see that that also has declined among our student athletes for both men's sports and women's sports. It could be that this conversation is harder to have, but it could be that there are other available resources on campus. And so rather than wanting to discuss it with coaches, perhaps student athletes are just more comfortable having these conversations with other clinicians or other providers on their campuses. Most of our student athletes indicate that they know where to go on campus if they have a mental health concern, about 2/3 of our student athletes. But only about half said they would feel comfortable seeking support from a mental health provider on their campus. We have a study currently in the field asking questions of our student athletes about what changes could be made to make them feel more comfortable, seeking support from a provider on campus. And so we look forward to kind of digging into that more deeply next year. But I think that's an area we really want to continue to explore. What can we do to make our student athletes feel more comfortable finding a provider on campus? But we do see that, over 2/3 of our student athletes say that there are at least people on campus that they can trust to give them support when needed. A majority of our student athletes know how to help a teammate who is experiencing a mental health issue. About half, a little over half of men, just under half of women say that they feel that student athletes' mental health is a priority to their athletics department. And, a majority of our student athletes do feel that the athletes on their campuses take mental health concerns of their teammates seriously. I think this is the really interesting item. We've been asking, our intent to intervene since 2012 in our first social environment study. And so we repeated those items again with this health and wellness survey. We see, student athletes consistently have indicated they would be likely or extremely likely to intervene when it comes to supporting a teammate in cases of alcohol use or drinking and driving. They're very likely to stop a teammate from driving or to help accompany a teammate home. And that's been very consistent across the board. But I would want to draw your attention to is where you see that gold highlight. This is a question about whether or not student athletes indicate they'd be likely or extremely likely to intervene in a situation if it could lead to unwanted sexual behavior. For our men's sports athletes, we have seen a very sizable increase in the willingness to intervene among men. In 2012, it was just 63%. In this most recent study, it is now 85%, which is just such a strong increase. For women's sports, in 2012, it was also 71%, and we saw that rise to 90% in 2016, and it's stayed relatively constant since that time. So just some really, I think, thinking about the effort that campuses have made in terms of sexual violence prevention and also bystander intervention training, it is kind of heartening to see this increase among willingness to intervene for both men and women in this area. All right, one of our last slides for everyone. We asked our student athletes, what do they wish their coaches and administrators at their school would talk more about? Thinking about all those items that we just learned about in terms of nutrition and access to healthy food, student athletes are very interested in learning more about proper nutrition and how to fuel their bodies. Some of this survey also examined, for our student athletes, supplement use, and I think better understanding supplements, and then also just what healthy foods can I eat for my competition is certainly something that our men's sports athletes and women's sports athletes are really keen to learn more about. Over half of our student athletes. Mental wellness also stands out here. 42% of men, 67% of our women's sports athletes indicating that they really wish their coaches and administrators would continue to talk more about this topic, even though we know that already people are talking about it so much. Also really high numbers in wanting to talk about getting good sleep. And I think that really kind of ties into the data that Kelsey shared with you a little bit earlier. The last one I want to point your attention to is really body image. We've looked at some of those items, some really concerning items for our women's sports athletes, not feeling confident in pictures, not liking their bodies. You can see 50% of our women's sports athletes wish that their coaches and administrators would talk more about body image, 16% for our men's sports athletes. So I just think a really important item here that definitely stands out to me. So how can you learn more about this study? If you go to the NCAA Research webpage, which is just at ncaa.org/research, Under the Well-Being tab on that page, you can find more about the NCAA Student Athlete Health and Wellness Study. We have, in addition to all the slides that you just saw, there are even more available to the membership or to anyone in the public who would like to learn more. There's a comprehensive deck on mental health, a comprehensive deck on substance use, and then also the slides that you just saw here are also available. Within the next few weeks, we will also have a more robust deck on student athlete nutrition, body image, and weight as well. All right, and that is our final slide for everyone. Again, that's our NCAA Research page. And then if you are interested, you can follow us on Twitter or X as well at NCAA Research.
That was great, Kelsey and Lydia. Really, really appreciate it. Let me ask a broad question first. So recently, the Board of Governors approved the second edition of the NCAA Mental Health Best Practices. So that's becoming widely distributed to the membership, and it will become effective in August 2024. So just looking at some of the findings, you touched on a lot from sleep to weight and body image issues to the comfort level that individuals have in seeking care and so forth. How do you take these findings and apply it to the mental health best practices? And let me get more specific about that. Every member school must have in place policies, education, and the like for mental health that are consistent with the updated NCAA mental health best practices. And that's divided into 4 core areas. One is creating an environment of wellness and mental health care seeking. A second is screening. A third area is really how to access care, both for routine and emergency mental health care. And the fourth is really identifying providers. So can you just speak just generally how this survey can maybe help campuses really implement the mental health best practices?
Well, I think one really important aspect here, and I think Kelsey definitely kind of highlighted this when she was sharing the mental health slides. For many of our student athletes, their intersecting identities may, in many ways, have interplay in really their overall mental well-being. And I think some great work that's been done by the Sports Science Institute and some of the committees that have been put together to really inform the second edition of the mental health best practices has been really thinking about how do we enhance mental health for our diverse student athlete population. So I think, these data, I hope, will help campuses kind of think about, what is unique to our student athlete population? Are we appropriately meeting the needs of our student athletes? Might we want to ask some questions? We may not need to do our own survey, but might we want to ask some questions of our student athletes in terms of their own level of comfort in seeking care on our campus? And as you can see in the data, there are certainly student athletes who want to talk more about mental health. They feel, they know where to access providers on campus, but they may not feel comfortable. And, maybe asking questions internally about what can we do to enhance that level of comfort, I think would be really important on the campus level. Kelsey, I invite you, if I've missed anything, to definitely chime in.
I think you did a great job to cover it. I think the only thing I would also mention is focusing on a system of care, because we saw, some student athletes, the majority of student athletes know where to go and what to do, but some may not be feeling comfortable on campus. So it might be making sure that the providers that are available, whether on campus, it's a referral off campus, are providers that the student athlete feels comfortable with, whether it's identity-based, whether it's a provider being able to speak to the athletics experience directly, or whether anonymity is really important, because I do think that there's still a level of stigma happening in seeking care, and making sure that student athletes are as comfortable as possible and have folks or a system that they trust when seeking care.
Yeah, and that comfort, it really starts right at the beginning of the year, and throughout the year. So creating an environment means that you're talking about mental health, that you're letting everyone know that mental health and physical health matter, that they intersect, that every sport team knows where to find the providers, who the providers are, and the providers really should be meeting with the sport teams as well. And it's really critically important that the coaches emphasize not only wellness, but mental health care seeking. And so I think the more we're proactive on that, the better we'll be. So point very well taken. Going back to the other point, and Kelsey, you were in particular talking about the higher rate of mental health issues in those who identify on the queer spectrum versus straight, and maybe help us understand. It's not because I identify as straight or if I identify as gay that's going to mean I have a mental health disorder or not. Isn't it more related to like social determinants of health, the environment that you're in, the sense of acceptance or non-acceptance that really determines the issues?
Absolutely. It's not because someone identifies a certain way as BIPOC or LGBTQ plus. It's the societal pressures and acceptance, right? We've seen a wave of political things happening, right? That are targeting LGBTQ plus folks across the country, not just student athletes, not just administrators, and that's impacting the student body. It's impacting our general population of folks that identify this way. So I mean, I think you stated it perfectly, Dr. Hainline. It's really the social pressures and the social, maybe the lack of acceptance or the lack of a well-being, an environment that promotes acceptance and well-being for those folks. So, yeah.
Yeah, so another take-home point is being proactive about those issues as well, because it really is a serious concern, and it's not just about having an increased risk of depression or anxiety, but suicidality, and so these are really core issues. Kelsey, you spoke about sleep. And no matter how much we talk about sleep, it seems that sleep remains a serious issue. And just for all of our viewers and listeners here, we know that sleep disorders predict suicidal ideation. Sleep disorders can predict mental health symptoms and disorders. Sleep disorders even predict musculoskeletal injuries more so than overtraining. So sleep is so critically important. I don't know if you have insight from this study about what we can do about sleep other than trying to be proactive once again.
Well, I think what the study tells us is like I shared earlier, there's a lot of work to do when it comes to sleep. We saw from the study that not only are a good amount of student athletes, especially women, not getting enough restful sleep in the past week, but they're also feeling dragged out during the day. Some are even falling asleep at inappropriate times and places. So there's a lot to do in this space. We know from some of our other studies, our goals study, for example, a little bit more insight on time demand. Student athletes are spending a great deal of time between practice, games, lifting, study hall, classes, extracurriculars, social activities, family. Everything needs more time, and there's only so much time in the day. And often what happens is sleep is the area that is sacrificed to get it all done. And so I think what we can learn from this study, as well as the goals study on time demands, is that coaches and administrators can be a little more cognizant and aware of prioritizing sleep and focusing on that for student athletes. And when it comes to scheduling practices or other activities, really making sure it's not hindering or reducing student athletes' sleep. If the team has traveled in late the night before, is it really necessary to get up as early as 6 a.m. or 5 a.m. for practice the next day? Simply just being aware that sleep should not be the area of a student athlete's life that should be sacrificed to fit everything in. So I think that that's an important takeaway from the study.
Yeah,
Can
it's a
I
great.
add one thing, Brian? I think also, when you look at that data about, for our student athletes who are getting, 0 to like less than half of the week they're waking, feeling rested, we find that they feel like they're not performing up to their ability. They're mentally and physically exhausted. Those student athletes who are well rested are far more likely to feel that they're performing at their best. I mean, sleep is, as we've talked about before, it's one of the best. It's a free, totally legal performance enhancing drug in so many ways. It is an amazing. It's great for everybody, and yet so often sacrificing your sleep is a point of pride, not for athletes, just culturally. I mean, people love to talk about how they are running on fumes, and that does not, it's just so sad that that's like a point of pride when it shouldn't be at all. There should be no like reward given to you for talking about the fact that you've only had 2.5 hours of sleep. So how do we kind of reframe the way that we're talking about sleep? And maybe even how do we help student athletes understand that a good night's sleep might be their best key to being their best on the field or on the court? How do we kind of flip the way we're thinking about sleep? It's not something that's, can be sacrificed or shortchanged just to get other things done, but where making sure you're getting sleep is actually going to make you your best, not only in the classroom, but then also in terms of your sport.
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it, Lydia. So, when we think of being an athlete, what we really are trying to do is to improve our performance, so our mental performance, our physical performance, really our spiritual performance, how we can really creatively go out and continue to drive ourselves to be better and better. And so you're absolutely right. I mean, both of you, when you talk about sleep being key for performance. But speaking of performance and perception, if the real focus is to improve your performance, Lydia, how do we change this other issue about weight, where you have about 50% of females believe that they need to lose weight, 50% of male athletes believe they need to gain weight. And I have a feeling that when you're trying to lose weight as a female athlete, that's not about performance. That sounds like it's about something else. I don't know if you have insight from the study on this, but it's very disconcerting.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way. And I think, certainly that's, we've had societal pressures on women to look a certain way or to fit a certain, body type. This is not new. This is something we've been talking about for decades, centuries, I'm sure. I think that the challenge here, though, is that for our student athletes, for some of them, they're at the peak of their, many of them are at peak in terms of their physicality and their athleticism. And yet, they may be engaging in behaviors that undermine their ability to be as strong and as, competitive as possible because they're trying to meet some kind of societal expectation over like an ideal body. I think that's true for men and for women. Right now, we have a survey in the field. Our wagering and social environment survey is in the field, and we do have additional questions about the intersections of social media and body image. That's an area we're really interested in learning more about, is how is the media that our student athletes are consuming, is that in any way exacerbating some of these concerns around body image? I feel like, I know athletics departments have been trying to address body image, particularly among our women, and disordered eating in particular for decades. But we really haven't made a lot of traction in these spaces because I don't think the societal pressures have changed in many ways. And so we're constantly fighting against those as well.
So it's another example when we look at health, and sometimes we look at health in a very narrow way. The social determinants of health, the societal pressures, they're so critically important. And when we talk about losing weight or the desire to lose weight, and then there's a spectrum or continuum of disordered eating to an eating disorder, which really has a high mortality rate. So we really need to pay attention to these things. Another issue you spoke about, and Lydia in particular, was early specialization. And I just want to make a couple of comments about that. For everyone, there's a huge difference between early initiation in sport, which should be for everyone, and early specialization, meaning that you're uniquely focusing just on one sport. And often that happens around puberty. So some of you know I really like tennis, and I just returned from the Australian Open, and Yannick Sinner, the Italian, he won a Grand Slam for the first time. So it's kind of a changing of the guard. He's a young tennis player. And in his acceptance speech, he thanked his parents for not forcing him to choose any sport at a young age. They just let him choose what made the most sense for him. And, he did many sports, ultimately found tennis and did pretty well. And so this isn't something the NCAA can do a lot about, other than to talk about the fact that early specialization just doesn't make sense for really anything. because we know early sports specialization is associated with greater dropout, greater burnout, more injury risk, and you peak at an early age and not when you necessarily want to. So something for us to continue to talk about, and maybe the NCAA as an umbrella can work with other national governing bodies to keep bringing home that point. I think we're getting toward the end of today's spotlight, but anything that stands out for Kelsey or Lydia for you in this survey, something we really need to do more work on?
I don't know if it's, well, I mean, we spoke on more work to do when it comes to sleep, awareness, education related to sleep. I just really want to drive home the point related to mental health and student athletes, knowing where to go, knowing what to do, which is great. That's a huge win, right? Because I don't know 15 years ago that the data would have looked as encouraging in that space. But I think really focusing on why they may not be comfortable on campus or off campus with the providers that are available. So figuring out what that looks like for each campus. But I do want to mention, the encouraging news, just hit on that again when it comes to some of our substance use areas. We are super encouraged by, binge drinking being so far down. The use of narcotic pain meds, there's been a lot of work in that space and that being down, especially particularly among those without a prescription, spit tobacco use being down. Those are all big wins because there's been a lot of work done in that space, particularly by Dr. Hainline and the SSI team. We were a little surprised that cannabis rates weren't rising in line quite at the same trajectory as they were with college students broadly. So I think that that's fairly encouraging. And then, of course, something to monitor is the high rate of vaping. But as I mentioned before, that seems to be a generational trend. And hopefully we'll see that go down in the years to come. But I'll stop there. Those are some of the encouraging things that we have been feeling, and I'm happy that we are able to have this platform to share this data once again.
Well, great. Yeah, and it is important to point out there's some really good news in this survey, so that is encouraging. So for everyone, we are going to continue the Spotlight series. We're going to focus on cannabinoids for a few series sessions, because as you may know, there's legislation that is being brought about across the divisions to no longer test for cannabis at championships. But that doesn't mean that we're taking a laissez-faire attitude. We actually are going to be taking a very, very deep dive into how to address cannabis use disorder at the campus level. We're going to have a spotlight series on pain. We'll continue with mental health. We'll have a spotlight series on sleep. And if you have ideas, something that you would really like us to focus on, please reach out to us. It's ssi@ncaa.org. We're always here to listen and always here to take suggestions. And I want to end this today's session really by thanking Lydia and Kelsey, not only for presenting today, but for the leadership that you show throughout the year. You're just so insightful for how we can really understand our student athletes better. The way you conduct the research and the rate of return on that is beyond exceptional. And it's really a privilege for me to work with both of you. And I look forward to continuing that collaboration. So thanks again, Kelsey and Lydia, and thanks everyone for joining us, and wishing you a good day.